So welcome. Today we're presenting on the Jedi skill of sense. This is our fourth session of the Solving for the Most Vulnerable series, and we are hoping that you find the information engaging and enlightening. In our previous session, Control, we learned about how we can understand ourselves, our biases, and how we can wield control to better align our intentions with our impact in our efforts to solve for the most vulnerable. As the great Bodo Baas has told us, the skill of sense is the second we must master. This skill is about recognizing our context and the systems that are exerting power within them. Before we get into it any further, I do want to remind you that this part of the session is being recorded. If you're with us live today, you'll find a handout for reflections for this session in the invite. You can use it to record your thoughts to the prompts in the session. Please note that not every reflection in that document will be included during our time together. You are encouraged to continue the work in the session, in the handout post-session. In the last 15-30 minutes or so of this session, we will share our insights and have a discussion on the content. That portion will not be recorded. There's also a survey for the session, again in that link if you're with us live, that I would greatly appreciate if you complete it so that the team can understand if we're meeting y'all's needs, and a short self-assessment, totally optional, but again, we'll use that data to reflect on how we're delivering our content. If you're watching this later, you can find these items in the same Google Drive folder you found this, and are encouraged to join us for any Jedi office hours to discuss your insights. And for anyone interested in and or in need of written content delivery, there is a written version of this session in the Drive as well. Today, we're going to start, as we always do, with our commitments and a shared belief. Then we're going to talk about the 5 senses, the 6 senses. We're going to talk a little bit about white supremacy culture characteristics, sensing your environment. We're going to bring that all together with our solving for the most vulnerable perspective. Have a brief summary of the session, that the content we're delivering today, and then touch on what's coming up next. As with all of our Jedi sessions, this will be a brave space, which calls for us to all identify and address our individual discomforts by creating a safe environment for others to do the same. And since this is the me talking portion, I'm not going to read through the commitments individually, but I am going to ask that you all commit to being brave as we review the content. Our shared belief for this session: we are all, always changing the world. Again, shout out to Octavia Butler. First up, the 5 senses. Okay, so this is your first prompt. All prompts throughout the session will be on slides that look like this one. For this prompt, we're going to do a little mindfulness exercise. So for the next 30 seconds, please reflect on the following. What is your context? Where are you? Why are you here? And what information is coming through your sense receptors? Your taste. What do you see? What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you touching? As children, we learned about our 5 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing. We learned our skin sends data about what it feels. Our taste buds tell us what's in our mouths. Our nose sniff the air. Eyes scan the horizon. Our ears are tuned for vibrations. We learned that these sense receptors send information about our environment to our brain, a quirk of evolution to keep us safe. As we've grown and science has evolved, we've learned that there are more than 5 senses, and more importantly, some folks' receptors don't work and or work differently. We've learned that there is a natural variety to the human experience. Think about one bit of data you received in your mindfulness moment. Did your brain name the input source? If so, where do you think that name came from? If not, Why do you think it didn't? Our sense receptors receive data, then transmit that information to our brains where it's interpreted, where it uses the same mechanisms that create our biases. Those same stories, filters, and buckets controlled by the system one or automatic part of our brain that allows us to quickly define, categorize, and prescribe a response to those stimuli. I'm going to play a sound. I want you to answer the following. What is that a sound of? If you were walking down Woodward and saw a really large feline animal with dark stripes and heard a deep roar, your brain would take those two bits of information and define what you saw and heard was a tiger. It would then categorize a tiger as a danger and trigger your body's stress response. You'll have an urge to flee, fight, or freeze. And I can't tell you which would be best because I don't have expertise in how to handle meeting tigers on the street, but I do feel like this would be a situation where your system one is telling you all the right things. You probably wouldn't have the same response if you saw that feline and heard that roar looking into the tiger enclosure at the zoo. Or maybe you would, but I doubt it would be as strong, and I really wouldn't encourage you to run through the zoo screaming. That's frowned upon for some reason. But that's beside the point. The point is that your interpretation of stimuli is based not only on the stimulus itself, the buckets in your brain, but also on the context that you're in. What's distressing in one setting could be soothing in another. That sound in the reflection was a car backfiring at a race. If you were at the race, that noise would have been categorized as nothing to worry about. But it's possible that even though you're safe, chilling in this meeting, it startled you. And more so, if you were walking through the streets of Detroit, your brain might say that what you heard was a drive-by, because maybe you hold stories about gun violence in the city, and your brain would say that you should be afraid for your safety. When you look at this photo, what stories are coming up for you? How are those stories impacting your interpretation of the scene? When you look at this photo, what stories are coming up for you? Are any of your other senses firing? The six senses. Science has discovered a sixth sense that mediates our ability to kind of know where we are physically in space. If you close your eyes right now, you would likely be able to kind of see where your keyboard is. You could probably reach out and touch it. That's what proprioception provides, a sense of self in the environment. How we interpret the information from our senses is directly related to our enculturation. This is because culture is the culmination of beliefs, values, language, experiences, and the meaning of those experiences. We call sirens sirens because our culture told us to. And this is also why snow isn't just snow to someone who is in Yupiak. It's also how we come to understand, how we are taught about who we are and who others are in the environment. This is why the sight of a group of Black teenage boys might bring up stories about gangs and violence. It's why we identify the woman in the photo as angry, and we might have even imagined her tone as strident. And why the word mammy brings up the image of an older Black woman, and the word skater brings up an image of Kyle. Our culture teaches us what is and what isn't, what should be feared and what should be celebrated. When our senses encounter information, we process it through our cultural understanding. White supremacy culture is the idea that white people and the thoughts and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. In the United States of America and many other places, but speaking to what I have firsthand knowledge of and experience with, we live in a white supremacy culture. One that in a million ways teaches us that a group of white teenage boys is not threatening, that movies with an all-white cast are an accurate representation of society, that millionaires are white men, and that women are white and children are white, and white folks should be making our laws, setting our standards, and elevated as our role models. But if white supremacy culture is omnipresent, the water, if you will, how can you even sense it, Brandy? Like, what are you talking about? Because fish don't know that water is wet, right? Is water wet? Anyway, how can we know that what we're experiencing in a context is white supremacy culture and not just, life? Well, do you remember the first time you tasted something sour? Probably not. But my point is, you had this experience and you knew what it felt like, even though you didn't have the words to describe it. Someone gave you the word, and now you use it fluently to describe similar experiences. As we've noted, language is a part of culture. It is a tool that provides a shared means to communicate experiences, such as tasting something sour. And so we can use this valuable tool to help us improve our ability to understand the experiences of white supremacy culture. In 1999, Dr. Tema Okun built on her work and the work of other activists and sociologists to generate a list of characteristics of white supremacy as it is expressed in organizations. Just this year, literally last month, Dr. Okun updated the list and created a beautiful website to share this information. In this section, we'll review a few of the characteristics and their antidotes. I strongly encourage you to continue learning by engaging with this content and other resources available through dismantlingracism.org and her latest site, whitesupremacyculture.info. Before we review the characteristics of white supremacy culture, I want to remind you that naming isn't shaming. Note, naming to shame does not fall under this value. If you're only pointing something out to hurt someone, you are not engaging in inclusive culture building. Some of these characteristics will be behaviors you've engaged in, maybe even like, ones that you believe in and that make sense to you. And you may hear these characteristics like tiger roars on Woodward. You may feel threatened. I am asking that you sit with that discomfort. And remember that as bad as it can feel to see yourself reflected in these characteristics, speaking from firsthand experience, it feels worse to be impacted by them. So first, let's talk about fear. White supremacy culture's #1 strategy is to make us afraid. When we are afraid, we lose touch with our power and become more easily manipulated by the promise of an illusory safety. Dr. Okun lists fear first because it is the foremost method used by white supremacy culture to uphold all its other characteristics. Fear in and of itself is a powerful motivator. Fear weaponized is destructive to everything in its path. We are enculturated to fear. Fear the other, fear not fitting in, of not being good enough. And we are told that our fear is normal and that it is natural to always be so afraid. Regardless of what we are exactly afraid of, we know that unchecked fear will drive behavior that pushes us further outside ourselves. We might make jokes at the expense of others because we fear not belonging. We overlook, discard, and denigrate what disturbs us, what and who we mistakenly believe is the cause of our fears. In our organizations, when we hear a candidate is being disqualified for not being a culture fit, we are likely sensing fear of disruption of the status quo. Thinking about fear in white supremacy culture, how have you been enculturated to fear the uncomfortable or unknown? A fear antidote. The antidotes to fear include, first and foremost, naming it when it arises, whether in a group or in us individually. We started the session with the reminder that naming isn't shaming because we understand that in order to create the change, we have to identify what's in our way. This means that when we recognize that we're expressing a fear of otherness, we call that out, which provides us the opportunity to learn more about why we are uncomfortable and more about that which is discomforting us. This also means that when we see others succumbing to fear, we can call attention to it so that collectively we can work to sit in our discomfort and refocus our efforts towards the change we want to see. Thinking about the antidote to fear in white supremacy culture, how can you use the antidote to combat how you've been enculturated to fear the unknown or uncomfortable? One right way, along with perfectionism, paternalism, objectivity, and qualify. The belief that there is one right way to do things, connected to the belief in an objective perfect that is both attainable and desirable for everyone. Connected to the belief that I am qualified to know what the right way is for myself and others. This is about assuming that there is such a thing as perfection and that we are able to prescribe the process to achieve perfection to others, enforcing our beliefs, values, and ideas upon them without their consent or input. This might look like folks in power making policy decisions that impact folks at lower levels without involving them or investigating what those folks really need to be successful. It's discarding outcomes because of unfamiliar methods. It's labeling someone as less intelligent because they speak differently than we do. Thinking about one right way, along with perfectionism, paternalism, objectivity, and qualify in white supremacy culture, how have you been acculturated to believe there is an objective and obtainable perfection? A one right way, along with perfectionism, paternalism, objectivity, and qualify antidote. Accept that there are many ways to get to the same goal. Once a group has made a decision about what to do, honor that decision and see what you and the community or organization learn from making that decision, even and especially if it's not the way you would have chosen. Sometimes we spin our wheels and halt potential progress by arguing for our own individual idea about how to proceed. This antidote asks that we get out of our and the collective's way by focusing on the end goal and accepting the will of the group and how to proceed. Reflection on one right way, along with perfectionism, paternalism, objectivity, and qualify antidote. Thinking about the antidote, how can you use the antidote to combat how you've been enculturated to believe there is an objective and attainable perfection? Denial and defensiveness. The habit of denying and defending against the ways in which white supremacy culture and racism are produced and our individual or collective participation in that production. Confronting racism and our parts in the system is challenging. We see ourselves as good people, and we've been acculturated to think of racism as being antithetical to goodness. Therefore, any observations of our racist behavior creates a crisis within us. Yet we know that even people with the best intentions can do things that are harmful. And we also know that impact is more important than our intentions. In our organizations, denial and defensiveness can be sensed when those in power choose to shut down communication around racism and their policies instead of seeking more understanding and analyzing their policies. Thinking about denial and defensiveness in white supremacy culture, how have you been enculturated to respond to observations of white supremacy by defending a person's intentions? A denial and defensiveness antidote. When someone responds defensively, ask them to talk through what they are defending or defending against. You might find some rich information that way. It would be all too easy to throw our hands up and discard someone as irredeemable because they become defensive when confronted with topics like racial justice. Yet, that would be us reducing the complexity of that whole person to their smallest part, their current reaction, and we would ourselves be engaging in characteristics of white supremacy culture. What we see as irrational denial of something obvious may make perfect sense to them. So before you write them off, attempt to understand more about their experiences and perspectives to see if you can find common ground to build from. Thinking about the antidote to denial and defensiveness in white supremacy culture, how can you use the antidote to combat how you've been enculturated to respond to observations of white supremacy by defending a person's intentions? Right to comfort and fear of conflict. The internalization that I or we have a right to comfort, which means we cannot tolerate conflict, particularly open conflict. Very similar to how denial and defensiveness shows up in organizations, right to comfort and fear of conflict becomes visible, especially in discussions around repairing inequities. Those in power may mistake observations about issues as attacks on their leadership and misdirect attention to the one who spoke up instead of the issue at hand. An example would be if a person brought up that the organization wasn't putting funding into supporting their stated goal of increasing diversity of candidates, and the meeting leader spent the next 10 minutes lecturing them on the appropriateness of questions for the meeting agenda instead of actually addressing their point. Thinking about right to comfort and fear of conflict in white supremacy culture, how have you been enculturated to put the comfort of white people before the safety and or protection of Black, Indigenous people of color? A right to comfort and fear of conflict antidote. Don't require those who raise hard issues to raise them in acceptable ways, especially if you are using the ways in which issues are raised as an excuse not to address them. Sometimes in challenging conversations like those about injustice, we can hear ourselves and others engaging in tone policing, which is fixating on the tone or volume of the speaker instead of the point they are making. This antidote is about putting aside our need to be comfortable and addressing all concerns regardless of how they are delivered. A note here, this is not about accepting abuse. If someone is engaging in abusive behaviors while they're attempting to make their point, you should put your safety first. Ask to pause the conversation to give you both time to regroup, but you should engage with that conversation again as soon as you safely can. Thinking about the antidote, how can you use it to combat how you've been enculturated to put the comfort of white people before the safety and protection of Black, Indigenous people of color? Urgency. Applying the urgency of racial and social justice to our everyday lives in ways that perpetuate power imbalance and disregard for our need to breathe and pause and reflect. The need to address and mitigate the impact of racial and social injustice is urgent. This characteristic is about misdirecting that sense of urgency to all other aspects of our life, which leaves us drained and unable to do our most pressing work. This may show up in organizations as accepting a too tight deadline for the short-term gain of a client at the expense of the well-being of the team. Thinking about urgency in white supremacy culture, how have you been enculturated to sacrifice yours and or others' needs for the sake of expediency? An urgency antidote. Developing a personal and collective practice of noticing when urgency arises and taking a pause to deliberate with thoughtfulness and intention about the nature of the urgency and the range of options available to you. We are all enculturated to rush, to approach every context before us as one that is urgent. This results in us feeling badly about ourselves when something on our very long to-do list of things goes undone. This antidote is a remedy and reminder that getting into the practice of pausing and really evaluating what is before us not only helps to reduce our anxiety, but it also gives us the ability to put more intention and consideration into our actions. Thinking about the antidote to urgency in white supremacy culture, how can you use the antidote to combat how you've been enculturated to sacrifice yours and others' needs for the sake of expediency? Sensing your environment. If a Black woman walks into a room, she will, within moments, be able to sense if the space she is in is oppressive, one that is unwelcoming, suffocating, and constrictive to who she is. Or if the space is inclusive, one that is welcoming, open to difference, and accepting of who she is. Some have said that Black and Native women seem to have a seventh sense, one that can sense isms in a context, a kind of hypersensitivity to people and environments. Though in truth, this could be said for any person with historically and or socially marginalized identities. But to my knowledge, science hasn't yet discovered an oppression sense receptor. So what's more likely is that people whose identities are targeted have had to learn to process their senses and potential threats received by them fast enough to save themselves from potential harm. They are more likely to pay close attention to the way people are physically within the space. Are folks sitting or standing? Who are folks communicating with? How are they communicating? Are there small groups chatting it up or cross-room conversations? What changed when the group first noticed them? Did the conversation stop? What is facial expressions and body language communicating? They'll know if eyes look them over and dismiss them or light up with joy. If conversations end abruptly, become whispers behind hands, or if they're invited to join in. If bodies are tense and moving away or relaxed and leaning forward. If a space to exist is created by a chair being added to the table, or if they're silently relegated to stand against the wall. Whether or not we have socially and or historically marginalized identities, but especially if we do not, we can all get better at focusing our senses beyond our personal experience to the greater context. If we hold any relative power in a space, we should be intentional and consistent about monitoring how that space we've cultivated is reacting to the presence or absence of others. Thinking about how our sense receptors pick up on tiny bits of information about an environment, what are some cues you've picked up in environments where you or others didn't feel welcome? All the senses unite. Intersectionality. Intersectionality, the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. While Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, a founding scholar of critical race theory, was interrogating the ways that law upheld racial disparities, she also noted the ways that Black women, because of their race and gender, face compounding or intersecting disparities. I encourage you all to read her 1989 article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, and check out the resource section of the written version for more about her work. She pioneered our understanding that gender, ability, sexuality, class, ethnicity, primary language, and all the other ways that society categorizes and organizes people can create multiplying disparate impact on their life, wealth, health, and opportunities. Dr. Okun also noted the importance of using an intersectional lens when looking at white supremacy culture and its characteristics in her work. I will offer that white supremacy culture and its characteristics could be more fully understood as non-exclusively white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied, wealthy, patriarchal, English-speaking, American-born, in our context at least, supremacy. In almost any instance where you sense white supremacy culture characteristics wreaking havoc on the lives of people of color, it's also impacting folks who aren't men and or folks who aren't heterosexual and disabled folks and poor folks and folks who have different ethnicity and folks who speak anything other than English as their first language. Like pretty much any folk who don't fit the stereotypical caricature of an American. So we should be asking if our fear of the other is in our way of allowing non-Christian holidays to team members. We should be asking if our defensiveness is keeping us from hearing how LGBTQIA+ folks are experiencing the environment. Is our belief that we know best blocking our ability to accept other ways of working? Is our discomfort with conflict in the way of discussions around gender pay inequities? If our sense of urgency has us rushing into constructing spaces that aren't wheelchair accessible, we should be asking which systems of oppression are impacting our context, and from there, take an intersectional perspective and approach to center folks with intersecting identities that are in the greatest need of support or most susceptible to risk. Solving for the most vulnerable is a problem-solving perspective that centers the needs of the person or group that is the most susceptible to risk or has the greatest need of support. This means that we cannot center ourselves, our feelings, and our comfort, because this ain't about us, it's about liberation and justice for everyone. White supremacy culture characteristics can and will get in the way of this work if we aren't conscious and deliberate. For example, fear may reduce our ability to recognize the problem because we are afraid of becoming targets ourselves. Denial and defensiveness may hinder our efforts to identify the most vulnerable because our need to protect ourselves from opposing perspectives, which can cloud our ability to complete our risk analysis. One right way, along with perfectionism, paternalism, objectivity, and qualified, could keep us from trusting that the most vulnerable understands the problem best and are the most qualified to lead exploring solutions. And urgency may make us rush to a solution without considering the impacts of the outcomes of our choices. So as we do the work of solving for the most vulnerable, we have to be keenly aware of when and how these characteristics are all up in the business and be ruthless in taking steps to reduce their impact on our efforts. Jedi, which stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Diversity is the collective representation of unique identities, ideas, beliefs, and perspectives. Equity is the intentional structuralization of providing what is needed for an individual to thrive. Inclusion is the intentional incorporation and operationalization of the uniqueness of each individual within the collective. Justice is the maintenance or administration of systems and structures that align with what is morally upright, guided by truth, fairness, and equity. We can use our Jedi sense skill to support our Jedi values by being aware of ourselves, others, and our space. Some examples could be understanding that our way of moving through a space is not the only way of moving through a space, and evaluating if our space is accessible to different physical, mental, and or emotional abilities, and then working to fix our space to enable their brilliance to shine. Listening out for defensiveness and dismissive communication to a team member expressing that their needs are not being met, and being an active advocate for them to be heard and their experiences addressed. Remember that any advocacy can only take place with consent. We can overcome our fear of conflict and learn methods to have healthy disagreements so that we're able to leverage all the perspectives in our space. We can call out our fears of having gotten it all wrong before as we analyze if our expressed values align with our stated values. Control is internal. It is the Jedi's ability to recognize the force in themselves and to use it to their benefit. In our last session, we learned about the Jedi skill control and how we can understand our internalized biases and reduce their impact on our environments, how we can leverage that skill in our efforts to solve for the most vulnerable and live our Jedi values. Our lesson today on sense is built on that effort, because in order to sense oppression in our environment, we first have to acknowledge it within ourselves. Only then can we tune our senses outside of ourselves. We can tune our ears to words that we have said that dismiss asking the most vulnerable what they need. We can tune our ears to look for our eyes to look for our defensive posturing when someone with less power confronts us about an issue. We can learn to taste when our mouths form opinions of others based on our fear of their differences. And with our evolved senses, we can begin to mitigate how our alignment with oppressive cultures can impact the context. A little bit of summary. So today we've talked about the characteristics of white supremacy culture as described by Dr. Okun. We have reflected on we ourselves have engaged in and witnessed those characteristics playing out. We learned that we can use our senses to perceive how we and others are being impacted by an environment. We reviewed how this enables our ability to solve for the most vulnerable, live our Jedi values, and why controlling our impact alignment is a must. Again, I encourage you all to check out the resource section in the written version to learn more about these concepts and the folk whose work we are standing upon. I do want to close this session with another little mindfulness exercise. So we're going to take 20 seconds. I want you to think about what is coming up for you right now. How is your body responding to your thoughts and your feelings? How will you process the thoughts and the feelings that you're having?